Hello and welcome to part 3 of our read aloud of Call It Courage by Armstrong Sperry. When we left off, Mafatu, after hearing Kana, his only real friend on the island, betray him and say some fairly negative things about his cowardice and his fear of the ocean, has decided to take off on his own. He stole a canoe and is now traveling out into the open ocean, very ill-equipped, as we read in part 2. And so let's see what happens with Mafatu, Uri, and Kiwi out on their own in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Day broke over a gray and dismal world. The canoe lifted and fell idly on the glassy swells of water. Mafatu looked back over his shoulder, searching the horizon for a last glimpse of Hikaru, but the atoll had vanished, as if to hide itself forever from his concern. The matting sail slatted uselessly, but there seemed to be no need of a sail. The little canoe was riding one of the mysterious ocean currents that flow in their courses through the length and breadth of the Pacific. The Aramoana, paths of the sea, as the ancients called them. They were the ocean currents that had carried the Polynesian navigators from island to island in the childhood of the world. Mafatu was drifting farther and farther away from his homeland. With wide flapping wings, Kiwi rose from the bow of the canoe. In ascending spirals, the bird climbed higher and higher until at last he was no more than a gray speck against the lighter gray of the sky. Mafatu watched his albatross disappear and felt a desolation and loneliness flood his heart. Now there was only Uri to keep him company in this hostile world of sky and sea. Uri, the yellow dog, lay curled up in the shadow of the bow, opening one eye from time to time to look at his master. Wherever Mafatu went, Uri too would go. All around, as far as the eye could reach, were wastes of leaden water. The canoe seemed to be the moving center of a limitless circle of sea. The boy shuddered. His fingers gripped the paddle convulsively. He thought of Kana and the other boys. What would they say when they learned that he had disappeared? And Tavananui? Would there be sorrow in his father's heart? Would he believe that Moana the sea god had claimed his son at last? It was an ominous, oppressive world at this season of storm. Half a mile distant, a whale heaved its varnished hulk to the surface to throw a jet of vapory mist high into the air. Then it submerged, leaving scarcely a ripple to mark its passage. A shoal of flying fish broke water, skimming away in a silvery shimmer of flight. A dolphin sped after them, smooth rolling in pursuit, so close that the boy could hear the sound of its breathing. This world of the sea was ruled by nature's harsh law of survival. Mafatu knew the sea with an intimacy given to few. He had seen fleets of giant mantas whipping the lagoon of Hikaru to a boiling fury. He had seen the mighty cachalot set upon by killer whales and torn to ribbons, almost in the blink of an eye. Once, he had seen an octopus as large as the trunk of a tamanu tree, with tentacles some 30 feet long, rising up from the mile-deep water beyond the barrier reef. Aye, the sea. Mafatu opened one of the green drinking nuts and tilted back his head to let the cool liquid trickle down his parched throat. It was more refreshing than spring water, cool even on the hottest of days, and as sustaining as food. The boy scooped out the gelatinous meat for Uri, and the dog ate it gratefully. The ocean current which held the canoe in its grip seemed to have quickened. There was a wind rising too, in little puffs and gusts. Now the canoe heeled over under the sudden attack, and while Mafatu scrambled onto the outrigger to lend his weight for balance, then the wind dropped as suddenly as it appeared, while the canoe righted itself and the boy breathed freely once again. He searched the skies for Kiwi. His albatross might have been one of 1,000 seabirds flying against the roof of the sky, or he might have vanished entirely, leaving his friends here in solitary space. The bird had led Mafatu out through the reef passage at Hikaru into the open ocean, and now, it seemed, had deserted them. A storm was brewing, moving in out of those mysterious belts which lie north and south of the equator, the home of hurricanes. The wind shifted a point, bringing with it a heavy squall of rain. Mafatu lowered the sail on the run and gripped the steering paddle with hands that showed white at the knuckles. All around him now was a world of tumbling water, gray in the hollows, greenish on the slopes. The wind tore off the combing crests of the waves and flung the spray at the sky. Like the advanced scouts of an oncoming army, wind gusts moved down upon the canoe, struck at it savagely. So busy was Mafatu with the paddle that there was no time for thought. He called a prayer to Maui, god of the fishermen. Maui e, and Matai tu. Somehow the sound of his own voice reassured him. Uri lifted his head, cocked his ears, and thumped his tail for a second. The canoe rose to the swells as lightly as a seagull and coasted like a sled down the frothing slopes of each wave. What skill had wrought this small canoe? This dugout canoe hewn from the mighty tamanu tree? It swooped and yielded, bucked and scudded, at one with the fierce element upon whose back it rode. The sky continued to darken. A burst of lightning lit up the sea with supernatural brilliance. An instantaneous crack of thunder seemed to shatter the world. Lightning again, striking at the hissing water. Mafatu watched it with fascinated eyes. Now it was all about him. It ran to the end of the boom in globes of fire that exploded and vanished in the awful moment of being. It revealed mountain shapes of dark water, heaving, shouldering. How long could this frail craft of wood and sinnet vine resist? Under the combined attack of wind and sea, it seemed that something must inevitably give way. The wind shrilled a fiercer note. Spray stung the boy's flesh, blinded his eyes, chilled his marrow to the bone. The sail went first. With a split and a roar, fragments of it were swept off the back of the wind. The cords that held the mast hummed like plucked wires. Then with a rending groan, the mast of the canoe cracked. Before Mafatu could leap to cut it clear, it snapped off entirely and disappeared in a churn of dark water. The boy clung to the paddle, fighting to keep his canoe from turning broadside. Water swept aboard and out again. Only the buoyancy of tamanu kept the craft afloat. Uri cowered in the bow, half submerged, his howls drowned by the roar of the elements. Mafatu gripped his paddle for very life, an unreasoning terror powering his arms. This sea that he had always feared was rising to claim him, just as it had claimed his mother. How rightly Mafatu was to fear it! Moana the sea god had merely been biding his time. Someday, Mafatu, I will claim you. The boy lost all sense of time's passage. Every nerve became dulled by the tumult of the storm. The wind howled above his head, but still Mafatu clung to the last steering paddle. Clung fast long after strength had vanished, and only the will to survive locked his strong fingers about it. Even death would not loosen the grip of those fingers. He held his little craft true to the wind. There was a wave lifting before him. Many the boy had seen, but this was a giant. A monster of water, livid and hungry. Higher and higher it rose until it seemed that it must scrape at the low-hanging clouds. Its crest heaved over with a vast sigh. The boy saw it coming. He tried to cry out. No sound issued from his throat. There was nothing that could be done. Suddenly the wave was upon him. Down it crashed, and then chaos. Mafatu felt the paddle torn from his hands, thunder in his ears, water strangling him, terror in his soul. The canoe slewed round into the trough. The boy flung himself forward, wound his arms about the mid-thwart. This was surely the end of his world. Then the wave passed. Stunned, gasping, Mafatu raised his head and looked about. For a second he could not believe that he still breathed and had air. He saw Uri wedged under the bow, choking for air. He pulled the dog free. Then he saw that his string of drinking nuts was gone. His fish spear was gone. The knife that hung about his neck by a twist of bark had been torn away. Even the paro of fiber tapa fell from his body as water soaked it through. He was naked, defenseless, without food or weapon, hurled forward on the breath of the hurricane. Numb of all feeling, empty as a shell. Still he clung to life, and the hours droned by. So gradual was the storm's easing that at first the boy was unaware of it. The wind was blowing itself out, moving off into the empty spaces of the world. Uri crept toward the boy, quailing beside him, whimpering softly. Night came and passed. There was no morning mist to dim the splendor of the sunburst across the swinging seas. Far away, the wings of an albatross caught its gold as it wheeled and planed against the roof of heaven. The only hint of recent storm lay in the rough and tumbling waters. As the sun climbed through the hot hours of morning, it burned into the boy's body like the sacred fires of the great mare of Hikaru. Mafatu's skin blistered and cracked. His tongue swelled in his throat. He tried to call out a prayer to Maui, but his voice was so thick that the sounds which came forth were no more than a hoarse cry. The canoe, stripped of sail and mast, and without a paddle to guide it in the swift racing current, twisted and shifted in the ever-rushing waters. As one hour merged into another, there came moments of fitful, choking slumber. a growing agony of thirst for the boy and his dog. The sun burned into them like an inescapable eye. The current which held Mafatu's canoe fast in its grip was bearing it swiftly on towards its mysterious destination. And thus the day passed, while night once more descended, bringing blessed release from the sun. Now the air was luminous with promise of another day. Out of the sultry mist the sea emerged, blue and violent. With the coming of this new day, terror raised its head. Mafatu tried to fight it back, to deny its existence, but it gripped his heart with clammy fingers, tightened his throat. He flung himself flat on the floor of the canoe and buried his face in his arms. He must have cried out then. His voice was but a hoarse croak, yet it stirred Uri to life. The dog's ragged tail gave one feeble thump. With the ghost of a whimper, the animal laid his hot nose against the boy's hand. The brave thump of his dog's tail touched Mafatu profoundly. He caught the animal close to him, while a new assurance, a new strength, flooded his being. If Uri could have the courage to die, surely he, Mafatu, could not do less. In that instant, he heard a whir and fury in the sky above, a beat of wide, mighty wings. Looking upward, the boy's dulled eyes made out the widespread wings of an albatross circling above the canoe. "Kiwi!" Mafatu cried hoarsely. "Aye, Kiwi!" Even as he spoke, the bird wheeled slowly, then flew off straight ahead for the distant horizon. The boy noticed then that the sea current was carrying him almost due southwest. Kiwi's flight moved in exact parallel. Once more it seemed as if his albatross were leading him onward, just as he had led the canoe out of the passage of Hikaru. Mafatu scanned the rim of the horizon. It looked as hard as the cut edge of a stone. But suddenly the boy's heart gave a great leap. It couldn't be. He leaned forward. It was a cloud, but the sky was cloudless. Far off in the sea shimmer lay something that was neither sea nor sky. The swells lifting higher, now revealed, now concealed it again. That shadow on the horizon. It was land. The boy flung himself forward, shaking uncontrollably. He seized Uri in his arms, then lifted him up, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Uri! Uri, it's land! Land!" The dog sniffed at the air and a little whimper broke from him. But what island could this be? Was it Tahiti, the Golden Island, whose language was akin to that of Hikaru? Or was it, perhaps, one of the terrible dark islands of the Eaters of Men? Now the current had a westward drift, and it was to the west that the dark islands lay. All day as the canoe drifted onward, the boy watched the distant shadow shape of land, not daring to take his eyes from it lest it vanish into the sea. Hunger and thirst were lulled into forgetfulness. There was only this one reality: land, escape from the sea. Weak as he was, he still clung to the thwart, his lips whispering a silent prayer of gratitude. With waning afternoon, the island took more distinct form as the canoe drifted nearer. It was high and peaked with a mountain, its valleys blue shadowed against the paler tone of the sky. Hour by hour, with every lift of the swells, the island rose higher and higher, filling Mafatu's soul with wonder. Hikaru, the only island he had ever seen, was as flat as his hand. But a great single peak crowned this strange island. Trees rose green and fair, tier upon tier of them, from the shoreline into the foothills of the purple mountain. Uri had caught the scent of the land now and was quivering with delight. Then from far off came the first muffled thunder of the reef, the boom of the surf high bursting on the barrier coral. That sound, was it the voice of Moana? Someday, Mafatu. Someday. Involuntarily the boy shuddered. Would his ears never be free of the sea god's threat? Mafatu was powerless to guide his craft. He sensed that the current had quickened, though. He could only watch helplessly as the little canoe, swift as the following gulls, rushed to meet the tides of the island where they met and churned in a cross-sea of conflict. Now across the swells came a sound like a chorus of ghostly fishermen, weary with their day's toil. Seabirds always complaining, never at rest, while softer, yet rising above it, was another sound, the voice of the reef itself quieting with sundown, like the reassuring hush of a mother to her child. Night stole up from the face of the sea, enveloping the world. There was no moon, but the black sky was spangled with unguessed millions of stars, other worlds, other suns. To the watching boy with land in the distance, they seemed closer and more friendly. The bottom star of the Southern Cross constellation pointed to the end of the world. A soft land breeze, heavy with a scent of flowers, wafted out across the dark waters, tantalizing and bittersweet. Weak with thirst, the boy drifted now into a merciful sleep. He struggled against it like a weary swimmer fighting a riptide, but his head drooped and his eyes closed. He was aroused at midnight by a thunderous sound in his ears, and all of a sudden he felt the canoe under him lifted and flung high into the air by a wave. Then down it crashed into splinters upon the reef. Boy and dog were hurled headlong into the churning surf. The shock of cold water brought Mafatu half back to consciousness, and blindly he struck out, fighting for survival. But Uri, where was he? No sign of the dog. The boy was aware that the canoe must have been flung over the barrier reef, for here the water was scarcely troubled by wind or tide. Now he was swimming. Somewhere ahead, a strip of beach, salt white in the darkness, lured him onward. His muscles did it of themselves, only through a will to live. A strip of sand, white in the night. Mafatu caught the gleam of a shark's belly close at hand, but on he swam. His unhampered limbs moved freely through the water. Of a sudden, there was something solid beneath his feet. Sand. Mafatu stumbled, staggered, fell to his knees in the shallows. His lips moved in dry, soundless speech. Lying there with the water rippling and breaking over him, he pulled himself half upright, swayed onward. The palms trooping to the edge of the beach were motionless in the night air. All the world seemed to hold its breath as this boy climbed up out of the sea. He fell to the sand once more. Then, guided by he knew not what impulse, he dragged himself to the edge of the jungle. A murmur of water reached his ears, soft as a chuckle of pleasant laughter. Water, sweet water! Down the face of an age-worn rock ran a small cascade, which lost itself amid ferns and cool mosses. A ragged, strangling cry broke from Mafatu's throat. He stood upright to full height, then crashed to the mossy bank. One cheek lay in the cool water. The moon lifted above the rim of the palms. It outlined in silver the form of a boy thin with hunger, naked as the day star. It revealed a small wet dog dragging himself across the beach to his master's side. Mafatu lay without moving. Before Uri drank, he touched the boy's cheek with his hot muzzle. And that is where we will pause at the end of part 3. And if you're anything like me and the students in my class, that last page or so, you're probably more concerned about Uri than you were Mafatu. He sees that shark coming by in the lagoon, and you're probably like, yeah, who cares if the shark eats him? Where's the dog? Thankfully, Uri was all right, and he has made it up onto the beach with Mafatu. They have found a source of fresh water, so at least for now, things are okay. But if we use a little bit of logic, and those of you that have read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you may remember the professor talking about why don't they teach them logic in these schools? Well, let's use some. There are 3 realistic possibilities for this island. Possibility 1. It's an island, maybe not necessarily Tahiti, but like Tahiti, where he would find a tribe that would be welcoming and accepting of an outsider, where he could make his way, overcome his courage before returning home. Possibility 2. This is one of the dark islands of the Eaters of Men, a tribe of cannibals, perhaps. Not a place Mafatu would want to be. Possibility 3, the island is uninhabited. And if that's the case, then that means Mafatu is alone. So if it's a welcoming tribe, Mafatu would find help. If it's a tribe of cannibals, Mafatu will not find anything he wants to find. If it's uninhabited, option 3, he may be completely on his own, struggling to survive. We'll see what happens with part 4 of Call It Courage. Join us then. Bye.